The Psalms don't assume that we share their worldview. They acknowledge that there are people who think differently about God and the meaning of life. Yet they also attempt to persuade us to align with the biblical worldview so that we would avoid what is evil and false, and instead find what is good and true in a life with God. Psalm 14. To the choir master of David. The fool says in his heart, "There is no God." They are corrupt, they do abominable deeds. There is none who does good. The Lord looks down from heaven on the children of man to see if there are any who understand, who seek after God. They have all turned aside, together they have become corrupt. There is none who does good, not even one. Have they no knowledge, all the evildoers who eat up my people as they eat bread and do not call upon the Lord? There they are in great terror, for God is with the generation of the righteous. You would shame the plans of the poor, but the Lord is his refuge. Oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion. When the Lord restores the fortunes of his people, let Jacob rejoice, let Israel be glad. Psalm 14 is nearly identical to Psalm 53, and while it's not the only time that the Psalms duplicate material, it's one of the most obvious. There are slight differences between them, which I'll cover in the episode on Psalm 53, but the common view is that 14 is the original form that was adapted later for 53 for a specific purpose and situation. In the titles for the podcast, I've called them the Song of the Fool, versions 1 and 2. And indeed, the fool shows up, bold and brash, in the first verse. The fool says in his heart, "There is no God." The word fool here means someone whose judgment of life can't be trusted, who has worthless ideas, who has nothing to offer, who has no help to give to others. His claim isn't so much about atheism. It's unlikely that those in this part of the ancient world would have denied divine existence in philosophical terms. Rather, the fool is voicing an attitude of practical or functional atheism, the kind of life in which people act as if there is no God. To the fool, God doesn't matter at all. This is a gesture of defiance and independence, like the scoffers of Psalm 1 who declare the power of their own autonomy and authority. David immediately names the outcomes of this rejection of God. They are corrupt. They do abominable deeds. There is none who does good. Notice that David is taking the plural now, because the fool in the first line is just an example, a representative of human beings in general. We are all fools. We are all inwardly corrupt and immoral. We all do terrible things in our selfishness and sin. And so David's conclusion in verse 1 becomes the refrain of this lament. There is none who does good. This theme reminds us of similar prayers in the laments that have come before, especially Psalms 9 and 13, where David feels alone and abandoned, because although he is trying to worship God and choose the way of blessing, it feels like everyone around him is recklessly choosing the way that leads to evil and death. After hearing the declarations of the fool, the perspective shifts in verse 2. The Lord looks down from heaven on the children of man to see if there are any who understand, who seek after God. We're meant to picture the Lord carefully scrutinizing and analyzing each human being, weighing their heart. The terms used here are often used in wisdom literature, so God is searching for those who are wise rather than foolish, where wisdom is defined as the fear of the Lord, reverence and obedience to God. Putting moral categories into these terms tells us something important. Every sin implies that we are acting as if we know better than God, as if we are wiser, which is the old lie of the garden, that human beings can define good and evil for ourselves. But the survey is conclusive in verse 3. They have all turned aside. Together they have become corrupt. which one scholar says contains the idea of milk turning sour. David's assessment was that there was no one who truly lives a God-centered holy life, and then God emphatically agrees, there is none who does good, not even one. Verse 4 concludes this depressing diagnosis with a horrible image of evil's effects. Have they no knowledge, all the evildoers who eat up my people, as they eat bread and do not call upon the Lord? David is under no illusion that the fool's words only affect himself and his relationship with God. A rejection of God also leads to hurting others. With an unconcerned complacency and ravenous appetite, the evildoers sit down to eat a meal. They pick up their utensils, and they devour God's people, those who reject the falsehoods of the fool. There are echoes here of Genesis 4 and 6, a time just before the flood when humanity's wickedness was growing worse and worse. It seemed like no one had compassion or care for one another. David's tone here is pleading not only with the evildoers to wake up and see how their sin is affecting people, how it's leading to harm. He's also pleading with God to do something. He is calling on the name of the Lord to act and fix the systemic effects of the fool's influence. How could God fix a whole society that rejects him and worships only themselves? Well, this is what the conclusion of the psalm seeks to answer. Just as suddenly as the fool speaks out, God steps in. There they are in great terror, for God is with the generation of the righteous. You would shame the plans of the poor, but the Lord is his refuge. David is describing a day when the arrogance of evildoers will be turned to terror because God is with the righteous and is their refuge. Just like the beginning of Psalm 14 alludes to the beginning of Psalm 1, so the end of Psalm 14 alludes to the end of Psalm 2, where God is the refuge, the fortress, the hiding place. In a moment of horrible clarity, the fool sees just how wrong he has been, and all of his unbelief turns into dread at the revelation that the living and true God is holy, that he cares for the poor, that he protects his people who call on his name and seek after him. C.S. Lewis wrote, "In the end, that face which is the delight or terror of the universe must be turned upon each of us, either as conferring glory inexpressible or inflicting shame that can never be cured or disguised." This is a common theme throughout the Bible. When God acts to save his people and judge evil, our response will either be humble joy or dreadful fear. The day of the Lord is either the best day or the worst day, depending on whether the Lord is your refuge. David concludes the psalm by breaking out in a song of hope. Oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion. When the Lord restores the fortunes of his people, let Jacob rejoice, let Israel be glad. It's a prayer for the Lord to make all things right again, to renew the world, to save his people from being devoured and return them to a place of safety. It pictures a world that is the opposite of what the fool said. Rather than a life lived without any reference to God, the life of joy and gladness comes from God and God alone. There's another way that David makes this point, but it's extremely subtle. In Psalm 14, there are 7 direct references to God or the Lord. And since 7 is one of the most common numbers in the Bible to represent fullness and completeness, David has crafted this psalm so that it begins with the absence of God, the fool saying there is no God, but he ends with the comprehensive fullness of God's presence. Not everything is as it appears. It may look like God doesn't see or care, but he is very present to save his people and make a fool of the fool. There's one more cool feature of Psalm 14. It comes at the end of a series of lament psalms, beginning with Psalm 9 and ending with Psalm 13. And David connects them all by using key words from each of those previous psalms. The poor of Psalms 9 and 10, the righteous of Psalm 11, the children of man from Psalm 12, and the salvation of Psalm 13 all appear in Psalm 14's 7 short verses. That might be a little bit hard to follow, but the point is this. Psalm 14 brings together all of the major themes from the previous psalms and weaves them into the bigger story of all humanity. When the Apostle Paul quoted parts of this psalm in his letter to the Romans, he argued that sin makes us think and act like there is no God. We all, David and Paul included, foolishly oppose our Creator, closing our ears and hearts to the one who made us, shouting with pitiful pride that we are the masters of our fates, hurting those around us with our selfish greed. But Paul goes on to explain how Jesus is the Son of God who became incarnate, who is the only one to live a perfect, righteous life, who died as a substitute for our foolish sin, and who rose from the dead to offer new life to all who believe. Jesus said that he is the bread of life, and while evildoers eat the flesh of the poor to satisfy their wicked desires, Jesus says that anyone who eats his flesh will never be hungry again. David prayed that salvation would come from Zion, the place where the Messiah King was enthroned as God's anointed one in Psalm 2. David longed for a refuge, for God to be with his people. And in Jesus, the Messiah King came as Emmanuel, God with us. And he now sits on the throne to offer joy and gladness to all who come to him for refuge from sin and death. One day, Jesus will return and restore the fortunes of his people, making all things new. There is no one who does good except for one. And in him, we do not have to be in the terror of judgment because we are righteous in him. One commentator succinctly summarizes the gospel of Psalm 14. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. The wise has said in his heart, there is a God, my God, and his name is Jesus. Here are some ideas for what it would look like to pray Psalm 14 in different circumstances in your life. When you meet a fool who acts as if they are a self-made, self-defined authority unto themselves. When you are trying to follow Jesus, but it seems like your faith goes against the grain of those around you. When you wonder if God can see all the mess that sinful human beings have made of this broken world. When your milk turns sour, reminding you of the corruption that all of us can fall into when we turn from God. When you eat bread and remember the greedy appetites of evildoers toward the poor and the righteous. When you want to grow in wisdom, to understand how the world works and learn from God's knowledge. When you fear the final judgment and wonder if there is any refuge from the holy, just judge. When you have made a wise and good plan, but the wicked try to undermine and shame your good intentions. When you are poor, and it feels as though evil people in power take more and more than you could possibly give. When you get home safely and breathe a sigh of relief in that refuge, which is just a glimpse of the safety that God offers us. When you long for God to make all things new, for Jesus to come back and restore your fortunes. When you want to experience the fullness of God's presence, God with us on earth as it is in heaven. Psalm 14, to the choir master of David. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They do abominable deeds. There is none who does good. The Lord looks down from heaven on the children of man to see if there are any who understand, who seek after God. They have all turned aside. Together they have become corrupt. There is none who does good, not even one. Have they no knowledge? all the evildoers who eat up my people as they eat bread and do not call upon the Lord. There they are in great terror, for the Lord is with the generation of the righteous. You would shame the plans of the poor, but the Lord is his refuge. Oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion. When the Lord restores the fortunes of his people, let Jacob rejoice, let Israel be glad. Thank you for listening to the Woven Psalms. This podcast is a ministry of Rock Hill Community Church in Duluth, Minnesota. I'm Mike Solis. I'm a pastor at Rock Hill, and I'm the writer of this podcast. Ethan Gibbs is our producer, editor, and composer of the theme music. Our logo was designed by Bo Walsh. This podcast uses the English Standard Version, published by Crossway. We want to give a special thanks to Poor Bishop Hooper for allowing us to use the music from their Every Psalm project. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please share it with others. You can learn more about our work at wovenpsalms.com.